Yes. I did another one of these, I don't know what prompted me to do it either. But let's enjoy it while we have it, because who knows when we might get another one. I sure don't. So, for this episode, I will be looking over my thoughts on the writing and storytelling done in the strategy role-playing classic, Final Fantasy Tactics. Or rather, we are talking about two such games. Now, on to the rambling. First, we cover my thoughts on the original Final Fantasy Tactics. For those who are unfamiliar, the world and story of the game starts out with a heavy inspiration on the War of the Roses. This is most apparent in the main political conflict that's playing out at the start before fading into the background, but also in some of the smaller details like the class divide. The story is told from the perspective of Ramza, the son of a powerful noble house that has, for his own reasons, decided to live the life of a mercenary and not get neck-deep into the political conflict over who should inherit the throne or otherwise rule the country. Before I go any deeper, I will point out that I know that a retranslation called War of the Lions exists and I've actually played that too. This doesn't actually change the details of the plot or characterization, but it does avoid some of the blind idiot nonsense that got into the original release. The ye old English is a matter of taste, and personally I didn't mind it. But otherwise, the story and characters are essentially the same and my thoughts apply to both. The game has a story of political maneuvering, along with moments where it touches on the brutal reality of a class divide and the sheer power that the rich have over society. The events are grounded in a sense of historicity and holds very few punches in depicting that while the antagonists are human and have very human motivations, that doesn't mean they're right or should be empathized with. They are more or less in it only for their own goals, and everyone else is just a pawn or sacrifice to achieve what they want. It helps build a contrast with Ramza, who is portrayed as having genuine concern for the small people that get trampled in the political and military machinations of the church, the other nobles, or even his own brothers. Final Fantasy Tactics also has a prologue that deals with class divides as a theme, acting as a discussion of it through the character of Delita. It shows how the elites of their world view the peasants and those who weren't of noble birth, seeing them as disposable at worst or useful pawns at best. And it's presented as something that is seen as the norm by most, but opposed by protagonists, with those in support of such a system being given as unflattering a portrayal as possible within the format. This class divide also comes up in later chapters, though not quite to the degree it did in the prologue. There's hints of corruption at the highest levels of their society, which is something that rings true in our world as it does in theirs. The use of magic to turn into demonic monsters is a little less applicable, though you can see it if you squint a little. I can certainly name certain politicians and billionaires who could be seen as turning into monsters, if they're not monsters already. Like a certain person who I shall not name but instead address as Enron Muskrat. A monster clown is still a monster. Just in funny clown makeup. Actually, some funny clown makeup might be an improvement, but I digress. And that part of the story is something I thoroughly enjoyed. What I did not enjoy was how the story shifted to a more generic Final Fantasy-style storyline about saving the world from an ancient evil being awakened. Honestly, the story kind of lost me there. To me, Final Fantasy Tactics is an example of a narrative that lost direction and suffers as a result. The latter half, the half that's more focused on saving the world, is the weaker part of the story, propped up mainly by Ramza wanting to rescue his sister Alma and the general heroic desire to save the world from a great evil. Gone are the complex machinations of the earlier chapters, or if they still exist, they end up folded into and secondary to the save the world plot. I think the story turns out weaker because of it, and that the story could still have had dark magic and church corruption play out without abandoning the original threads of the plot. The hints of church and elite corruption leans into and lends itself to the shift in focus from political plot to save the world plot. And as noted, I think it could have been done differently. Ramza could have just as easily gotten involved in a long-term plot to dismantle the corrupt elements of the church before they do any further harm without requiring some ancient evil be fought. Religious corruption and the horrors that can be brought about because of faith and devotion to a flawed organization claiming to be in service to a higher power can be a compelling plot on its own. One thing I will admit is that the shift is just gradual enough that you don't quite notice it until there's enough momentum in the game side of things to have you keep going to the end. It's only in the aftermath, once I took some time away to contemplate the plot, that I realized I was more or less distracted and the War of the Roses style plot I was invested in was resolved off-screen by a character that I hadn't been in control of since the prologue ended. And it's implied that he had his own complicated adventure of his own happening entirely outside of what Ramza was getting involved in, barring a few points where their paths intersect. Honestly, I found myself more invested in Delita's largely unseen adventures and scheming over Ramza's storyline as the game progressed. Sometimes I wonder what the game would have looked like if you played their stories in parallel and removed the more standard fantasy save the world plot, instead showing two similar but different protagonists navigating the same political and social mire in different ways. In the end, the narrative of Final Fantasy Tactics hooked me in on the promise of a political plot, with some class divides on the side. What I had at the end was a shadow of that political plot in the background, replaced instead with one determined man's quest to drag his allies through battlefields against corrupt church officials and demon cultists to save his sister. And save his home while he's at it. While by no means a bad story, I strongly wish it stuck to what it promised at the start or gave something similar. I feel as if the story promised me at the start wasn't the story I got in the end, and a part of me feels unhappy and dissatisfied as a result. And now we move on to the other half of this, my thoughts on the story and writing of Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. And this game? This game is far more coherent about the story than its predecessor. The setup of this game involves a group of kids from a real world being thrown into a fantastic world, with each of them falling into a position that superficially fulfills some of the things they want out of life but can't or don't have in the real world. The protagonist, March, begins by trying to navigate his way through the new world and the rules it imposes, but eventually he goes on to try to convince the others that they need to go home. This game has a scale that can feel as big and as important as the political machinations of Final Fantasy Tactics did, but I found the motivations and narrative ultimately more personal. And in many ways, it is actually far more nuanced because of how it handles and writes the characters. March rails against being caught in a false world, a reality that feels like a lie to him, and the jarring realization that the others he's trying to shake out of it actually like that world. In his desperate need to go home, he is putting the happiness of his friends and brother at risk. It can make him come across as monstrous and callous, focused on ripping people away from their dreams and happiness to force them into a world that doesn't care, and in the process condemning the people of the fantasy to oblivion. Except if one takes a moment to read between the lines, things aren't perfectly happy for his friends either. They've all gotten what they wanted, but in the process lost something they needed. They've become self-absorbed bullies in 2 cases, while the third became cold and distant whereas she used to be more open and approachable. They've become worse versions of themselves, and it's implied a few times that March realizes that. Unlike the predecessor, Tactics Advance sticks to its guns throughout. It focuses entirely on March's journey through the fantasy world he finds himself in and in trying to get back home. I personally find it an amusing contrast to not only the others trapped in that world but also to his literary descendants in the isekai genre, who all revel in the new world they're in. I like how strongly the theme of facing reality rather than running from it resonates through March's insistence, but without making it difficult to empathize with the other characters. Ritz, Mute, Dund, and even Cid all have understandable motivations and reasons to want to stay in the false world. The game shows us these reasons, and introduces to us the context of their lives in the real world so we can better see why they'd oppose March's idea of going back home. There's a certain beauty to be found in a story that is about grounded motivations, about wanting a better life. A hallmark of making a great character and a skill I do not possess is the ability to understand what a character needs and why it's different from what a character wants. And Final Fantasy Tactics Advance does this with aplomb for most of the characters. Ironically enough, March is the only one that doesn't go through this. Sure, the game has some annoying gameplay elements in the law system, but as a narrative, it holds together well. And while it is a little too easy to read March as an uncaring maniac who stubbornly wants to drag other people back into their unhappy circumstances simply because it would return him to a place of familiarity, that strikes me as a surface-level reading. The ending does show that the lives of the people affected do make some improvement and it's not as miserable as before, though there's no way March could have known that. In the end, my take on the game's narrative is that it presents a decent case for March's side and an equally decent one against him. And yes, the ending does offer validation for March's argument and that facing reality is better than running away from it, but I feel as if that was put there mainly because that's what the theme of the story ultimately is, and facing reality is a fairly standard lesson to be imparted in this kind of narrative. Well, used to be, at any rate. Isekai has changed things a little. Ultimately, between the two, I prefer the setup of the original Final Fantasy Tactics, but Tactics Advance is the more coherent of the two. The older game loses sight of how it started gradually, shifting the story into something generic as if they were afraid of not doing so because of the Final Fantasy branding. Tactics Advance has a more low-to-the-ground narrative hook and can seem childish at first glance, but offers a more nuanced take on bullying and the impact it can have on people. It also does not completely dismiss the value of fantasy and escapism even as it hammers on the point about the need to embrace what's real. Anyway, that is my rambling for this episode. Maybe there will be more, who knows? I sure don't. Oh, one last thing. If you check the description, you'll see links to 2 of my novels on Smashwords. If you use the coupon code M2275 at checkout, you'll get 25% off. Coupon is only good until the 9th of June, so might want to check that out.